welcome to the show. We are so incredibly glad you are joining us for today's deep dive.
Yeah, really thrilled to have you here.
Before we even jump in, please take a quick second right now to like and subscribe to the show.
Definitely do that.
That way you never miss out on these explorations. So today we are bringing you an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating review of a highly controversial ebook. It's called Superstitions, Folk Mythic Knowledge, about heroic man, the archetypes, and sinister women by Conrad Riker.
It is quite the title, and it's quite the read.
It really is. And look, if you want to understand the history of our modern institutions, and specifically understand how this author believes they were essentially captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies before reading it yourself, you absolutely need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Right, because whether you completely agree with its premise or, vehemently disagree with it, this text offers a really deep, provocative look into a massive, growing cultural movement.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the distinct worldview of men's rights activists and the red-pilled manosphere, which is exactly the target audience this book is written for.
Yeah, the author presents a highly specific philosophy that essentially diagnoses modern Western society as fundamentally broken. The core argument here is that the central institutions of our culture, from universities to hospitals to the justice system, have been actively hijacked and fundamentally rewired.
Now, before we get into the weeds, we need to make something crystal clear right out of the gate. Today, we are taking absolutely no sides.
None at all.
We are impartially unpacking the claims, the history, and the philosophy laid out in this source material. Our goal is strictly to help you, the listener, understand the exact ideas driving this ideological movement.
We're neutrally reporting the author's arguments without endorsing them, just mapping the territory for you.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the book's core premise, which is this idea of the masculine architecture of reality.
Yeah, the author argues that Western civilization was built on logos, meaning logic, reason, and highly structured thought.
But he claims this entire foundation is currently being systematically dismantled by what he calls a leftist mind virus, which he describes as a gynocentric or female-centered emotionalism.
What's fascinating here is how the book frames language and education as the primary weapons in this cultural war. Riker heavily contrasts the classical foundations of thought with modern university cultures. For instance, he points to Aristotle's syllogism.
Wait, let's pause for a second, just for anyone who might be a little rusty on their classical philosophy. Aristotle's syllogism is essentially the foundation of logical deduction, right?
Right, exactly.
Like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's a formula where if the premises are true, the conclusion simply must be true, regardless of how anyone feels about it.
Precisely. It is cold, hard logic. And the book pairs that with the scientific method's reliance on Karl Popper's theory of falsifiability. That's the idea, that for a theory to be considered truly scientific, there must be a way to prove it false through rigorous testing. It demands objective proof.
But the author's perspective is that today's institutions have entirely abandoned these frameworks.
Completely abandoned them, yeah. He argues that modern academia now prioritizes lived experience and emotional comfort over that kind of objective truth. He cites examples of university debates being entirely canceled simply because a student group claimed the topic made them feel marginalized.
So from the manosphere's point of view, logic itself is now being labeled by these institutions as an oppressive, patriarchal tool.
Exactly. It's basically a claim that objective reality is being replaced by subjective feelings.
And he goes into deep detail on how modern corporate and academic institutions use things like inclusive language mandates and mandatory diversity training to effectively police thought. A major, highly specific example he uses to prove this point is the case of James Damore.
Yes. The Google memo.
Right. Damore was the Google engineer who was fired back in 2017. He wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed biology and psychology studies regarding average sex differences in occupational preferences. He was basically trying to explain why there might not be a perfect 50-50 gender split in tech.
And the book uses the Damore firing as a prime, undeniable example of its thesis. Riker argues that Damore wasn't fired for being scientifically inaccurate.
He was fired because he dared to use facts that conflicted with what the author calls gynocentric dogma.
Precisely. The author asserts that in the modern corporate world, objective truth is actively punished if it threatens the emotional comfort of the collective.
Which is a pretty staggering accusation. If you buy into his premise, he's basically describing the modern corporate and university systems the way someone else might describe the Matrix.
Like it's an artificial reality.
Exactly. An artificial reality designed entirely to keep men docile and compliant. And if facts are being punished, that naturally leads into how behaviors are categorized. Which brings us to the book's fierce critique of the term toxic masculinity.
The author argues that this specific phrase, toxic masculinity, is a weaponized lie. He claims it was designed to pathologize the very traits that historically built human civilization. He points to that famous 2018 Gillette ad as a cultural turning point.
Oh, I remember that one. The tagline was, "The best a man can be." And it showed men breaking up fights and stopping street harassment.
And it caused a massive uproar.
It really did. And Riker's interpretation is that the advertisement effectively painted all men and their natural instincts as inherent problems that needed to be fixed by modern feminized oversight.
He claims it treated boyhood roughhousing and male competitiveness as social diseases.
Hold on, so he's actually claiming that traits like stoicism and dominance are being treated as literal diseases. How does he back that up institutionally?
He points directly to the 2019 guidelines released by the American Psychological Association.
Okay.
The author argues that these guidelines literally label traditional masculinity, specifically listing traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and fierce self-reliance as a mental health threat. Riker argues that these are the exact survival traits that built the modern world. They are the traits required to build a bridge, defend a border, or win a war. And now, he says, the psychological establishment is treating them as pathologies to be cured.
And the book argues this has a particularly devastating impact on boys, right? Because if you treat a boy's natural instinct as a disease, you're gonna try and medicate it.
Exactly. Riker points to the skyrocketing rates of ADHD diagnoses in young males over the last few decades. His interpretation of that data is, of course, highly controversial.
Right, as I mentioned.
He argues that natural boyhood energy, restlessness, and a biological desire to physically challenge boundaries are not disorders. But because they don't fit into a quiet, sit still at your desk, feminized educational system, they're being systematically drugged.
He describes it as the heroic instinct being chemically castrated simply to create compliant, docile students.
It is a really intense framing.
It is. I really want you, the listener, to pause and consider how societal labels shift over time. Regardless of where you personally stand on this issue, it's a fascinating thought experiment. The idea that behaviors historically deemed absolutely essential for the survival and defense of a tribe are now categorized as literal clinical disorders by modern institutions.
It's a massive reframing of biology.
And that reframing extends to how the book views the history of medicine, too. Here's where it gets really interesting. The author takes a highly unique, deeply counterintuitive angle on the masculinization of herbalism and the medical field.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most unexpected chapters in the text. He traces a historical lineage that claims healing was once a rigorous, results-oriented male discipline.
Which is funny because we usually think of herbalism or natural medicine today as being somewhat female-coded or part of the modern wellness industry.
Right, but Riker talks about the barber surgeons of the Middle Ages, the battlefield medics in the Roman legions, and medieval monks who cultivated massive botanical gardens. According to the book, these men practiced a form of pre-scientific empiricism. It was trial, error, and objective observation without any emotional attachment.
So what changed according to his worldview? How did we get from stoic battlefield medics to the modern healthcare system?
He places the blame squarely on figures like Florence Nightingale.
Wait, Florence Nightingale, the founder of modern nursing.
Yeah.
He paints her as the villain of this story.
He does. It's a radically different way of looking at the history of nursing. The author claims that Nightingale essentially hijacked the healing tradition. He argues she weaponized compassion, turning medicine away from a stoic masculine discipline of objective problem solving and reframing it entirely as feminine emotional labor.
That is wild.
He believes this shift eventually birthed the modern pharmaceutical industrial complex, which he views as a feminized system designed to keep people dependent and heavily medicated.
And his solution to this is something he calls the Green Cathedral. The book details some really fascinating examples of modern male foraging collectives. He specifically highlights groups like the Cascadia Fungi Guild out in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, the foraging collectives.
He highlights the use of natural compounds, specifically mentioning things like kratom for pain management or deep mycology and mushroom foraging as a literal act of rebellion.
Right. It's not just about taking plants for health, it's an ideological stance. The author frames this as men reclaiming their bodily sovereignty. He argues that the modern system wants to keep men dependent, compliant, and popping pills prescribed by an institution that already hates their masculinity.
So learning to heal yourself with plants out in the wild is framed as a direct rejection of that control.
Exactly.
Well, if the author believes boys are being medically pacified in schools and men are being kept dependent by modern medicine, it makes total sense that his distrust extends to modern psychology, too. This rejection naturally bleeds right into his intense critique of modern therapy culture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the book aggressively contrasts the modern cultural push, telling men to just go to therapy, with his proposed solution, which he calls the ritual imperative.
The ritual imperative.
The author insists that men simply do not heal through talking circles, journaling, or verbal processing. He views all of those as distinctly feminine frameworks designed by a system that fundamentally doesn't understand male psychology.
So if talking about your feelings is off the table, what is the ritual imperative? How does a man heal in Riker's framework?
Through structure, rigid hierarchy, and most importantly, shared ordeal. The book explores the historical role of groups like the Freemasons. It dives deep into the Spartan Agoj.
And for context, the Agoj was the incredibly brutal, state-sponsored training regimen that all male Spartan citizens had to endure from childhood to forge them into warriors.
Right. He also points to the strict, unforgiving structure of the military.
And he mourns the decline of these institutions in modern life. He specifically points out things like the Boy Scouts' rigorous 50-mile hikes being phased out or softened over the years.
Yeah, the softening of those rites of passage.
He argues that by removing these intense physical challenges, society has left boys completely adrift. They have no way to prove their capability to themselves or their peers.
Which is where he introduces this concept of the alchemy of pain. Riker argues that modern society's obsession with avoiding discomfort fundamentally makes men weak. He references figures like David Goggins,
the ultra-endurance athlete and former Navy SEAL.
Yes, Goggins is famous for pushing the human body past unimaginable limits. The text suggests that intense suffering and rigid discipline, things like waking up for 5 a.m. workouts, prolonged fasting, and extreme cold water exposure, are not punishments.
They are necessary, vital tools to forge an unbreakable man.
It's the idea that pain delivers vital data. It teaches you who you are. And a culture that prioritizes safety and emotional comfort above all else is, in his words, committing civilizational suicide.
It's a very intense focus on male authority and structure. But how does the stoic, unbreakable individual fit into the broader society, specifically the family? Because this brings us to the book's blistering critique of modern family law and the justice system.
This is where the political and social arguments of the book really reach a boiling point. The author argues that the modern state has effectively replaced the patriarch in the family unit.
He details claims that modern welfare systems intentionally incentivize single motherhood, making the father financially and structurally obsolete.
And he argues the family courts operate with a severe systemic bias against fathers when it comes to custody and divorce proceedings.
He spends a really significant amount of time unpacking what he calls the myth of the wicked woman. To back this up, the book cites U.S. Census data showing that approximately 73% of divorces are initiated by women.
Which is a real statistic.
Right. And Riker takes that modern statistic and links it all the way back to the ancient biblical archetype of Samson and Delilah.
It's a powerful metaphor for his audience. He uses Samson and Delilah to illustrate the concept of intimate betrayal. The idea is that a man's life, no matter how physically strong or structurally secure he is, can be completely dismantled from the inside by a partner utilizing emotional leverage and the power of the state, rather than physical force.
And he extends this critique of emotional leverage to the legal system at large. The author heavily criticizes what's known as the Duluth model.
Yeah, the domestic violence framework.
For those who might not know, the Duluth model is essentially the standard framework used by local police and courts across the country for domestic violence intervention. Riker argues that this model operates on a default assumption that the man is the primary aggressor and the female is the victim, inherently assuming male guilt.
He applies this same critique to Title IX's campus tribunals, arguing they function as kangaroo courts.
Exactly. According to the author, these systems entirely erase the masculine concept of due process and objective law.
He points to foundational texts of Western justice, things like the Magna Carta, or William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, which establish the principle that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer.
Raker argues that modern society has traded that stoic, objective law for emotional mob rule.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, what does this all mean? We've walked through this sweeping critique of universities, hospitals, psychology, and the courts. What is the author's ultimate solution for the men who are reading this book and feeling completely alienated by modern society?
He calls it the final stand and advocates for the creation of what he terms the new monastery.
The new monastery.
The book is essentially a rallying cry, a call to arms for men to literally unplug from the matrix of mainstream media, corporate HR departments, and what he views as feminized institutions. It strongly advocates for forming tight-knit, male-only physical and digital brotherhoods.
He specifically points to real-world groups like F3 Nation. F3 stands for Fitness, Fellowship, and Faith. It's a network of free, peer-led workouts for men held early in the morning outdoors.
He also highlights localized underground men's circles. But the key distinction here is that these are spaces where men bond through physical trials, shared labor, and silent witnessing.
That is a crucial distinction in his philosophy. The author is very clear. This is not about getting together to cry.
No, not at all.
It is not about emotional trauma dumping. It is entirely about accountability.
He summarizes his ultimate call to action by telling men they must actively reject the modern victimhood narrative completely. They must embrace strict Stoic discipline, build their own independent networks outside the view of the state, and absolutely refuse to apologize for their inherent masculine nature.
It is an incredibly heavy, intensely polarizing exploration of the modern cultural fracture between the sexes.
It genuinely is. It requires you to look at the entire history of Western civilization through a radically different, highly combative lens.
We are wrapping up this intense deep dive, and we really want to acknowledge that this text is provocative. It challenges almost every baseline assumption of modern progressive society. But it is a vital read for anyone trying to genuinely understand the specific ideologies, the historical grievances, and the philosophical frameworks that are driving the manosphere today.
You simply cannot understand the modern cultural landscape without understanding the scale of the arguments being made here.
Very true.
This raises an important question, and it's a thought we want to leave you with today. We've just spent this time analyzing a worldview that sees our institutional narratives as deeply, perhaps irreparably divided.
Yeah.
If our society is increasingly fracturing into these heavily segregated ideological camps, where one side views modern empathy, inclusive language, and therapy as necessary human progress, and the other side views those exact same things as a mind virus causing civilizational decay, what happens to the men and women who don't fit neatly into either of these boxes?
That is the big question.
Where is the space to build, to connect, and to belong in the future for someone who doesn't perfectly align with either the hyper-rigid heroic masculine or the purely nurturing feminine archetypes?
It is definitely something to ponder as we look at the culture around us and try to make sense of where we are all heading. Before we go, please remember to take a second to like and subscribe to this deep dive so we can keep bringing you these incredibly thorough explorations.
Please do.
And as a final reminder, today's deep dive was a comprehensive review of Conrad Riker's ebook, Superstitions, Folk Mythic Knowledge about Heroic Man, the Archetypes, and Sinister Women. If you want to read the source text for yourself to truly grasp the history of our institutions through this specific lens, make sure to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it. You can also follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.